This is Air Force Oral History Interview number 1361 with Otis F. Bryan. The interview dates are 14 and 15 December 1982, and the interview was conducted in Greeley, Kansas by Dr. James C. Hasdorf. This is tape 3 of 4, and both sides are recorded.
At the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, when I checked out on the B-17s in 1936 at the invitation of Bob Olds, I became acquainted with Kirk at that time. He was just a lieutenant colonel, I believe, no, a major. And all of us, or most of us, flying large aircraft had discussed the navigational facilities that would be necessary to operate a high-flying aircraft over long distances. And of course, during such conversations, celestial navigation was probably the most talked of. So Kirk had done quite a bit of work in the field of celestial navigation, and I was very much interested in learning about this field of celestial navigation. So I spent quite a bit of time with him discussing this and finding out about things and so forth. So then after I came back to TWA, when the people from KLM came over and it looked like we were going to have trouble with Europe, then I set up a school in TWA and trained about 15 or 20 pilots as celestial navigators, including myself. I took the course very carefully. And he was a very likable fellow. He was rough and tough, but he was a very likable fellow. And he moved right on up through the ranks to become commanding officer of Strategic Air Command, and he made his name, I guess, on being commanding officer of the B-29 group in the Pacific. He replaced Possum Hansel out there in that group. And that was my association with him. There's nothing outstanding except I was just friendly on this particular subject with him.
Did you at that time foresee that he was going to rise as high as he did?
No. No, I think he surprised many people.
Why did you feel that way?
Well, he was a rough type of, in the services, usually you have two types of officers. You have the diplomatic type that usually prevails around Washington, and then you have the combat type out in the field. And you might say you have the third type, the administrative type, to run the group. Well, Kurt was strictly the combat type. He was a rough, tough guy, and you never saw those kind of fellows get up much beyond the combat units. And I thought you would probably see a more diplomatic type of man get to the position of 4 stars or something like that.
Well, war does some strange things.
It does at that. Yes, and in Washington particularly, they've been trained and going through the school at up here at Leavenworth, and the Army School and Staff School at that's at Maxwell, isn't it? Chief of Staff School. Where is that down there? The training for top officer command. So
Command and General Staff School.
Yes. They're usually more for the diplomatic type of officer that can handle men, handle personnel. Kirk was like these, you know, he was like the buck sergeant. That's the way he handled people.
Kind of rough jewel.
Yeah.
Did you run across Frank Andrews during that period? General Frank Andrews?
There was General Andrews. He was at Langley Field when I went there. I met him and talked to him 2 or 3 times. And that's the only time I ever saw him. I don't know what happened to him.
There are some that hold that he would have been the top man in the Air Corps had he not gotten killed.
Yeah, that's right. I remember some people saying he was the outstanding one. I remember that.
Did you have any appreciation for him?
No, I didn't know him that well. I think the only time I had contact with him was a couple of, when I was down there, was at the officers' club or something like that, or social contact.
Were there any other officers that rose to prominence during that period that you rubbed shoulders with?
Well, there was Benny Chidlaw. Let's see, he'd get up pretty high. I don't know how
4-star.
Yeah. And let's see, who else that I might have. Ira Aker.
Ah, yes.
And there are probably others.
How well did you get to know R. Aker?
I got to know him fairly well. He was in commanding officer in European theater, England. I was down in London, talked to him quite a few times, and then Washington, heard from him and so forth. Fairly well. I mean, they're not buddy-buddy, but these people were friendly, you know, and you get to know them, and they know you and know your family and what you did and so forth, and they'd sort of keep their eye out. And it was a very nice relationship. It wasn't a case of going out and playing golf with him, because no one had time to play golf in those days.
Well, did you visualize then that he would become such an articulate spokesman for air power?
Who now are we talking about?
R. Aker. You know, he wrote any number of columns.
Yeah, I had a letter
through the
from him
year.
not too long ago. Well, it was about a few years ago. He was in Washington, and no, I liked R. I wouldn't say I observed that. I suppose he had it, but I just didn't know it, didn't sense it.
All right, getting back to your presidential trips during the war, in the book The Flying White House, it mentions the fact that Churchill at the Cairo conference came rushing out in his bathrobe to bid FDR farewell.
Yeah.
And pictures were made of the occasion, and it embarrassed him to no end.
Yeah,
Could you comment on that incident?
It was early in the morning, and we were taking off for from the field there. I forget the name of the field. And everyone, it's about 6 o'clock in the morning when we getting everything ready out at the end of the runway, and hear this car come running out the end of the runway, and I stopped and got the steps down. So we get in. And it was Churchill. He got out in his bathrobe to come to tell the president goodbye. That's why he missed him. You know, he'd overslept. So the President Roosevelt, he got abused. You know, he got the photographer to take a picture of him. Churchill didn't like that. He raised the hell about it. The president got his picture. So he told the president goodbye, and we took off.
I've never seen any pictures of that in history books or anything. He must have kept pretty close.
I expect that President Roosevelt kept them in his own files.
All right, then after the Cairo and Tehran conference, was this when you flew the Yalta trip then?
Yes. Well, at the Yalta trip, the Air Transport Command had the Sacred Cow, and they'd set up a pilot, Hank Myers and his crew, to fly it, and I was not supposed to, you know, I wouldn't be necessary for me to fly him anymore, because I was running this other thing. And when the time came to go, General Arnold called me over and told me he wanted me to handle the flight. So then General George, the Air Transport Command, he talked to General Arnold and said he wanted his crew to fly it. So it got to be a little touchy thing, and I got stayed out of it. But then the president called me over and said, look, I don't care what goes on there, but I want you there, and I want you to make, in any emergency, to make command decisions on the plane. You're the top pilot. He said, this thing between General George and General Arnold, he said, I don't know, but said, I want you there. He said, I'm telling General George that you are to be there as my representative. So I never told Myers or any of the other people that. No one knew that. Now, I don't know what the president told General George, but that was my position. I had to watch, and if anything had gone wrong, I had the authority to stay there, and I flew the airplane part of the way. But and then some of Myers' crew, none of them knew about this. And I didn't think it was necessary to tell them, and I didn't tell them. I didn't tell anybody about it. But that's what happened on it. My position then was what you'd call a command pilot today, you know, have somebody do the controls. But, and it was two very short flights. We flew from Malta over to Yalta, and then we flew from Yalta across the northern Mediterranean over Devaswara, about 70 miles east of Cairo, where he took a ship back to the States.
Well, according to the book, The Flying White House, quote, also ignored in the official account of the Yalta flight was pilot Myers' unhappiness with the FDR staff over the naming of Bryan as his co-pilot for the Sacred Cow. He thought it was a, quote, political, unquote, move, end of quote. Did this cause you much concern?
No. Who said that? The co-pilot or somebody?
Well, this was in the book by J.F. Terhorst and Colonel Ralph Albertazzi. And they're
I read that
supposedly...
book, and there were mostly rumors in that book. Very few facts. Well, I guess part of it was factual, but they raised a lot of questions. No, that didn't bother me. I never knew about anything like that. Myers and I were good friends. He called me afterwards when they wanted him to fly Truman. Of course, they asked me to fly Truman, become Truman's pilot, and I told them I couldn't because of my work with the airline. So I said, we'll get Myers. And Myers called me several times, asking me about things. We were good friends. This was just made up by somebody.
You'd never believe that when reading this. And the book also noted, quote, so while Bryan had to be taken along, Hank treated him only as a passenger, said Smith, unquote. Well, was this the case?
No.
You know, Smith was the co-pilot on that. I interviewed him some years back, and he never mentioned any of this either.
Well, I'm surprised at that. Smith was a pretty nice young chap. I never knew him too well.
Well, like you say, the book probably doesn't have too much accuracy in it then.
But that certainly was not the case. No problem. Myers died several years ago, and well, see, we were friends. I had no problem whatsoever. I had a touch of the ptomaine poisoning or something over on the trip, and stayed in the room a couple of days and sick in the hospital there. But
how did you contact that?
Oh, you get it from eating stuff and on the trip and things like that. That's prevalent during that time. You get diarrhea.
Well, was it readily evident that President Roosevelt's health was rapidly deteriorating?
Oh, yes, yes.
I've seen pictures of him at the Yalta conference, and he looked like death warmed over during that period.
Yeah, he... I was standing back of that when that picture was taken.
It's been alleged that because of his poor health that he wasn't in his finest form during the negotiations that took place at the Yalta conference. Do you think that's true?
No. He was feeling bad. You can see that. 2 years before, when at Casablanca, he always a robust coffee, but here he was. Well, you can see he's drawn and face there. Paul Watson died on the way home on the ship, and then he passed on about 2 months later. Roosevelt.
Was there much concern amongst the crew that he wasn't going to be able to make the trip very well?
I never heard about it. Admiral McIntyre was the one who was with him all the time, you know, the doctor who took care of him, and I never heard anything about it.
They had some movie films of him at the conference, and you could tell the way he moved around and greeted people that he was evidently in very bad shape.
Mm-hmm. Well, he didn't look good. I talked to him on the... He liked for me to come back and talk to him once in a while on these flights where it's clear weather, stuff like that. I talked to him as we went across the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, and he thought he did an excellent job at Yalta. He said that Stalin only wanted 4 things: to come into the war. And going over, everybody was saying, well, we got to get Russia in the war against Japan, you see. And he said Stalin wanted 4 things. He wanted the north half of Sakhalin Island back that the Japs took from him in 1904. And then he wanted an open port on Siberia there someplace. And then he wanted to clean up the line between Russia and China in there. And this minor thing, according to Roosevelt, and then something else. But Roosevelt took the position that these are very small things that they agreed to in order to get Russia into the war against Japan right away. And he talked just in that vein, you know. So he didn't say anything, or didn't indicate anything of these things that the media made.
Like the occupation of Eastern Europe and all that.
All that stuff. So.
Well, when you left Yalta, where did you fly the president then?
We went to Devaswar, that is a field about 70 miles east of Cairo, on the lake, on the canal. And he took I think it was a cruiser Memphis, married back to Washington. See, at that time, that was before they knew about the atomic bomb. General MacArthur was training the 10th Army to invade Japan, and he expected to lose 1 million troops on the initial assault. And everybody was, upset about all this situation. They thought the main important thing was to get Russia in the war against Japan. So when they made the assault from the east, well, they'd be also engaged from the west. And it was then 6 months later, after Japan was defeated, and the atomic bomb and everything, well, then people turned around and said, well, what in the hell did they agree to these things at Yalta for?
Did you meet General Larry Cuter at
Yes, he was
Yalta?
General Marshall's aide. Yeah, I met him several times.
Did you get to know him very well?
No, not too well, only just as an aide, you'd contact him, talk to him, that's about all.
You know, he wrote a book about his experiences at Yalta. Airman at Yalta, I think is what it was titled.
I don't know. I didn't know him that well. Of course, hell, there were plane load after plane load of people to Yalta, It got a big thing after that. First trip was a few people and the president.
But did you have any contact at all with Stalin yourself while you were there?
Oh, no, he talked to an interpreter one time. It just happened to be a meeting where they were, and he wanted to know what I knew about the Russian pilots and so forth, just personal type questions and so forth. It was only maybe a 5-minute conversation.
You had no real opportunity to...
No, I couldn't answer many of these questions because I didn't know them. I know that I looked at their planes and talked to some of the pilots. They had planes more or less like the Spitfire, and even stripped down more. They're very light and fast and very susceptible to enemy fire.
All right. Your son made a note here that that there were practice runs for these presidential flights. Was that the case?
I think he's referring to the one from Cairo to Tehran. Admiral McIntyre told me never take the president above 8,000 feet because of his heart condition. And from going to Cairo and Tehran, the terrain was above 8,000 feet. And the only way I could get there was a circuitous route going through a valley across the mountains there into Tehran. And I made a practice run up there to make sure I could get through the valley. I had to stay at 8,000 feet and so forth, which I did, and which the president enjoyed. He enjoyed seeing the country, flying down low. And it was a nice, cool day and no bumps or anything. And that was the practice run. On the others to Yalta, we made a run over to Yalta and back from Malta, but that was just flying over and back. No need for it. Hell, you get in there, you got a field, you don't do anything to get there anyway.
Well, Yalta's a resort area, isn't it, for the Russians?
Yes, it's more or less like Southern California area. Maybe a little colder, maybe like San Francisco type of place.
Was the weather pleasant during the conference while you were there?
Yes, yeah, very good, man. Got pretty cold one night, but otherwise very good. Well, where the airport was on the other side of the peninsula. Then I went across the car, and that was a little different territory. That's colder than over where Yalta was. Yalta was on the warm side. I don't know. It'd sort of be like, well, I can't give you a good analogy of it, but it'd sort of be like the weather at Palm Springs versus the weather at the Los Angeles airport.
I guess those high mountains there is what moderates the temperature, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Well, you get the warm winds on the east and south side, and on the west side you get more or less north wind.
All right. Well, your son has a note here about your relationship with the Air Force crews, especially Hank Myers, and the fact that it may be a bit tense. But you say that wasn't the case at all.
No, that came out in that book. The White House.
The Flying White House.
Flying White House. That came out there where this co-pilot Smith said some things that were not true. I don't know. I didn't know he was that kind of a guy.
No,
well, you see, he didn't know this other. He didn't know this other situation, but Myers had a reputation of being sort of a little on the wild side of flying, and he made. I think the president's group knew it, and he was General George's pilot. But the president. He liked the way I flew. He selected our crew over Pan Americans because he liked the way we handled things, flew with things, and he just got accustomed to it, and he had confidence in me. He didn't know who Myers was or anything. A strange pilot, might have been the best in the world, but he still wants somebody there that he knew, he had confidence in, and that's why I was there.
Did you ever have occasion to fly Harry Truman?
No.
Did you ever have any interface with him at all?
Used to play poker with him once in a while. Jack Fry lived in Washington. He'd invite congressmen over, and they'd have poker. And if he didn't have enough to fill out a game, well, he'd call me and ask me to come over and sit in with him. I did that 2 or 3 times. Harry Truman was there.
He's the one that initially he was looked down upon by historians, but as years go by, he elevates in stature as time goes on.
Well, Truman was not the smartest man in the world. He might have been intelligent in some field, but he was not the type of individual that you would consider being presidential timber. You know him as a man.
But on the other hand, they say he had a surprising grasp of history, that he was well read in even ancient history.
Well, I wouldn't know anything about that.
Playing poker with him, he didn't,
he didn't
elicit any of that.
Yeah.
Was he as salty as he's been cut out to be?
I don't think so. I think it's overdone. He made that decision to go into Korea, and of course that gave him a degree of toughness even against the group up at Long Island there, United Nations. And that gave him a stature of being tough, so forth. And I think he played on that. And then his fight with the newspaper man over what he said about Margaret.
Yeah, that was quite notorious. Well, for how long a period during the war were you actually on leave from TWA?
Well, it'd be just these trips. Usually it'd take about a month. I'd be in uniform for about a month or 6 weeks.
In other words, you'd go right back to the
Yeah,
company again.
yeah.
But you never knew when you would be pulled away again.
No. And those are the only 3 trips the president made by air during these 16 years.
What was the? Were you able to keep your job going on course while you were
Yes, I
away
had
on these?
a pretty good assistant. I took charge, moved in. Well, you had to have in those days because you never knew when something else had happened.
Well, what was your actual position during these
Well,
years?
I was vice president and in charge of all TWA war contracts, which was this airline I studied about, and 2 modification centers, Kansas City, and some secret test work and so forth, other little odds and ends. That all came under my jurisdiction. And I had my office in Washington, D.C.
Well, this secret test work, was this related to military affairs? Or?
Air Force, yes. Special things they were testing. We did most of it right here at Kansas City, obviously, but it was, they'd have some stuff like, something new for an aircraft. So we'd put it on an aircraft and test it to make sure. And that was kind of work we had done. They'd want somebody tested. See, they were pretty busy getting these combat pilots together. They didn't have much around research and development in the military force at that time. And there wasn't too much of it, but it was a place we had several planes and some pilots and crew. And it was pretty self-containing.
Well, I didn't realize that the airlines had actually gotten involved in secret work for the military. I thought it was primarily the aircraft manufacturing firms like Boeing, Lockheed, and so forth. But you say that TWA was...
Let me give you an example. I probably should have told this when you're talking about airplanes. This Boeing 307 Stratoliner that we've discussed, after I flew it here and flew it a while, I was asked to run the proving test, 100-hour proving test over the airline before we carry passengers. And on a trip to Kansas City to Albuquerque, down over Wichita, I ran into some heavy thunderstorms and turned west. It was supposed to be able to fly off the airline and turn west to get around them. Well, when I got over at the corner of Colorado in that area, I couldn't get on top of the aircraft. The clouds had built up over there, so I headed straight for the radio terminal east of Albuquerque out there at Moriarty. And they had changed the heating system on the carburetors on these engines. And heretofore, we'd always had, when you put the carburetor heat on, 100-degree temperature rise. If the carburetor temperature was, say, 20 degrees, we pulled the heat full on, it'd go up to 120 degrees, air going in the carburetor. And the engineering department decided that the pilots were using too much heat, detonating the engines at times, which we were. After all, when you start picking up a load of ice, you don't give a damn about a little detonation, you know, you just put the heat on, open the throttles, and go on. So they said that instead of taking the heat from around the exhaust pipes, they just take it from underneath the cowling to the carburetor, and they tested, and that'd give 40-degree rise, 40-degree heat rise. So on this flight, the outside temperature is about 20 degrees. So I pulled the heat on all the carburetors, and the temperature went up to 60 degrees. And we turned into these clouds, and I wasn't in the clouds more than at 22,000 feet. I wasn't in the clouds more than a minute or so until my number one engine quit. And I thought, with a new aircraft, stuff like that, I'll turn around and get back out and see what's wrong with that engine. But before I turned around, all the other three quit. And that left me up there at 22,000 feet with 4 dead engines and some passengers in the back, and over pretty rough terrain and solid snow and ice, snow mainly at that altitude. So we came on down. We couldn't. I had a engineer on board. He couldn't get them started. I tried my best to get them started. Couldn't. So when I got down about halfway down, I called a hostess, senior hostess forward, and told her to wrap herself in blankets and quilts and stuff back by the door. And when we stopped, the first thing to do is get that door open, passenger door, because you're always afraid of fire after something like that. So she did that. And then when I got down to about 2,000 feet above the ground, I saw a spot over one of those big canyons, and I deer hunted out in there several years before. And usually when you got a big canyon here, over here someplace, you got a mesa. So I turned to the left, and just as I got turned out, I broke out underneath it in a heavy rain, and it was raining hard then. There was a slight clearing ahead, but I had heavy rain and about less than a mile visibility. So we didn't have time to get the gear down. And when we hit, they scooped up dirt in the baggage compartments. The doors came open. The baggage compartment was underneath that with the gear up, and came to a stop about 200 feet from that canyon. And when we stopped, it wasn't a hard landing. We saved the ship. I came out there with about a week later. We had some angle iron and mechanics, and we fixed the landing gear up, and I flew it out of there about a week later. So it wasn't. Brought a fluid into Kansas City for my overhaul. It wasn't terribly damaged, but like landing with the gear up. And just as we landed, the girl got we had one casualty. Just as we landed, the girl got the bottom of the back door was about 4 or 5 feet high off the ground, the way the plane was setting. She got the door open, and we had about 8 or 10 TWA pilots on board. And just as she got the door open, one of those brave pilots pushed her out, jumped out and stepped on her shoulder and hurt her shoulder. That was the casualty we had. But
well, what caused the engine to stall?
Well, it was, again, once more, a very simple thing. No one had thought it through to conclusion. You take the carburetor of any internal combustion gasoline engine. It's one of the best refrigerators, constant refrigerators you can have, because when that gasoline comes out in a stream under pressure, it vaporizes and mixes with the air, and it has in these carburetors, it had a 40-degree drop of temperature. When the air went through, it was 60 here. You remember I told you it's 60 degrees? When it went through this carburetor, it dropped 40 degrees, and where it goes into the cylinders, the fuel goes into the cylinders, it was again down to 20 degrees. So this air, supposed to be warm, dry air under the cowlings, wasn't warm, dry air at all. It was warm, moist air. And when this air came in there, we kicked it up to 60 degrees, and then we went down to 40, and then went down to 20 degrees again, and where it spread out through these pipes to each cylinder, it froze solid ice and couldn't get fuel to the cylinder because of the moisture. There wasn't enough temperature there, so it wasn't hot enough. It was down around 20, and that's just the right place for it to pile up. And within 2 minutes, you shut the fuel off from all the engines.
And you couldn't get it restarted when you
No.
got way down low?
No, it was still, where we landed was still almost freezing. You see, by that time, the props had stopped. And there's no way in the world we could get it started because you had ice solid on a small line about the size of your little finger, about this long, on all those 18 cylinders on each end, and that is 4 times 18, that is 72 cylinders, 72 lines you had frozen solid in there.
Well, were engineering changes made as a result of that?
Oh yes, yeah, we went back to 100-degree heat rise, and then we put alcohol on those lines, so if we ever got them partially clogged or anything happened to heat, we could dump alcohol in there, and that would clean them out, any fuel and ice.
Well, if you hadn't have gotten that plane down safe, you would have wiped out half of TWA's pilots, wouldn't you?
A good bunch of them. And the people up at Link, they have a good artist up there. And here, he made a sketch of this. He made a sketch of this. This is, from my description, he took a picture of the airplane, made a sketch of that. Was his sketch of my landing. He gave me this picture, this painted picture he made.
And that's very accurate, huh?
Yes. You see? See the gears up and the props are stopped, and how rough it is down here.
Well, you were lucky to get it in at all.
Yeah.
All right, this morning I'd like to recap a little bit of what you had talked about yesterday. You mentioned Charles Lindbergh earlier. Was he as right-wing and pro-Nazi as he was painted in some circles?
Not in my opinion at all. Slim, as we all called him, and he was with TAT when they helped organize it when the airline started, was more of a technical type of individual, but a forthright person who spoke exactly what he believed. When he went to Germany, he saw the Air Force they had. He flew their planes. They invited him to do so. He saw the tanks running around the country. He saw the artillery, the infantry in training. And he came back, and his belief was that Germany will conquer the world if someone doesn't do something about it. Well, that was horror to the United States position at that time. It was confirmed by our Vice President of Engineering, as I mentioned yesterday, Tomlinson, when he went over, and he came back and said the same thing. And this is what got him in trouble, because that was in 1938, 37, 30, somewhere in that circa time frame. And this was what got him labeled as a right-wing pro-Nazi, which was not true. He was no more pro-Nazi than the average American citizen. He was just saying what he saw and what he believed.
Yeah, it's been asserted that he was also a racist.
Well, many people were at that time. Many people were at that time. The country was, I spent quite a bit of time in the South, and I've seen this thing change, and at that time I would say greater percentage of the United States citizens were racist.
It's just no longer fashionable.
That's right. That's right. You remember at that time when World War II was declared, up until that time, they would never let a colored man in the Marine Corps. They'd wash him out. They never let him in the infantry. It was only when the war was declared that this thing began to change prior to World War II. So when you say a man was racist in 1930, he was just one of the big majority.
Also, in the notes that your son gave me, he noted that you flew Roosevelt at 8,000 feet or less through Iran because of heart problems. Was this the case? Was it a heart problem that...
Yes, this was the case. Admiral McIntyre, President Roosevelt's physician, on the first flight, had a general talk with me. He called me over at the White House, and he said, we like, of course, to have the president fly as smooth a flight as possible, and he said, under no condition is he to fly above 8,000 feet. He said his heart is weak, and I don't want him above 8,000 feet. And he said, if you ever face a situation where you have to go above 8,000 feet, you let me know. He said, I'll be on the plane. He said, you come back and talk to him and let me know. And he said, then we can probably do something about it. But he said, under no condition is he to go above 8,000 feet because of a heart condition. Now, specifically to the flight to Tehran, at Cairo, we went from Oran to Carthage to Cairo. At his conference in Cairo with Kai-Shek and Churchill, he said he wanted to go to Tehran to visit with Churchill, or with Stalin. And then I talked to Admiral McIntyre, and I said, Admiral McIntyre, maybe we can get through the mountains on a smooth day up there at 8,000 feet. I don't know. I said, I simply don't know. And I said, the only thing for me to do is to take the plane and go up there and see if I can find a way through those mountains at 8,000 feet or below, and then come back and tell you. So he thought that was excellent, an idea. I went off and found this, got my maps and traced out this pass on the, well, it was quite a bit of south of the course, where I could get through that range of mountains at 8,000 feet, or a little below if I had to. And it was wide enough. This pass was the smallest, closest the hills got together was probably a mile, mile and a half. They're usually 4 or 5 miles wide. But the peaks went up on each side. And I came back and told him, reported to Admiral McIntyre that it could. So the flight was set up. And that's why I took the president, and he flew. It was a very smooth day. It usually would be rough in there, but it was in the morning and it was smooth. And when he got to Tehran, he called me back and he said, that is the best flight I've ever had. He said, that's the most interesting thing I've ever had, to see the ground and see the people and terrain from the aircraft and look up and see those mountains. He said, Otis, that's wonderful. So he enjoyed that. And that's, I stayed around, I never did quite get to 8,000 feet. I got probably 7,800 feet. But I stayed under the 8,000 feet in accordance with Admiral McIntyre's directions.
How long were you in Iran at that time?
Several days. I'm not exactly sure. I would say about 4 or 5 days. Now, there's an interesting story there. If I might take a moment to tell it. The night before we approached, night before we got into Tehran, the Germans dropped, the German lines were about, 400 or 500 miles to the west. See, that pushed east that far. And they dropped about 700 parachutists in the mountains just west of Tehran the night before. And the objective of those parachutists was to wipe out the presidential, the party, in Tehran, Churchill and Roosevelt. So, but the Second Army was stationed there, and Russia had a large number of troops there, and the British had some troops there, and they were out early the next morning and captured all of these Germans. Apparently the German troops were second-class troops that they just picked up, at that time was fairly late, and dumped in there. Well, to do that, then they took Roosevelt's party. He had most especially had a separate villa to stay in, he and his party. But they took him and took him over to the Russian compound, where they had troops enough to defend that, and Churchill, and they all stayed in the Russian compound for the day and never got out of there. And then we moved into the Army barracks from the villa we were in, so we could be protected, but there was no problem whatever. The Army did an excellent job cleaning up those parachutists and getting them out of there. And of course that added a bit of excitement to it, to Roosevelt, and they were all, but it was a nice day, and much was accomplished between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill at that meeting.
You mentioned off the tape a while ago that you had made some 10,000 flights overseas during the war. Aside from taking the president on these conference flights, what was the nature of all the others?
The first flight was in the latter part of, first part of February 1942, when we got the first airplanes ready to make the over-ocean flight. And we had about 3 weeks to get them ready, put in extra fuel tanks, take out the pressurization, and increase the range of the aircraft to haul equipment over to Rommel in the desert out of Cairo. He was about 75 miles northwest of Cairo at the El Alamein there, facing Rommel. The main purpose of that rush act was that General Montgomery, was out anti-personnel fuses for his artillery shells. And we had to take 3 plane loads of these fuses over for him to use in his artillery. After he got these fuses, there were several thousand pounds in each load, then he prepared for battle and chased Rommel back up the coast towards Tunisia. That was the purpose of the way it started. Then we were told, then we kept running supplies and personnel to Cairo. And a little later on, they asked us to start then flying across the North Atlantic from Washington to Prestwick, Scotland, which we did. And all the flights during World War II, I made approximately 50 flights over myself as a pilot during the 3 or 4 years. And we made a total of, during World War II, of more than 10,000 flights across the Atlantic, carrying supplies, personnel, and all of these things we've talked about. Eisenhower, I took him on his first flight, and Mark Clark, and Averell Harriman, and Secretary Lovett, and General Marshall, and General Arnold, and all of those people on various flights across in these 5 planes. And then that fall, we began to get the C-54s, and they were substituted. We got more of them, and one time we had about 35 C-54s, and a large number of personnel. We had a total of about 7,000 people in that division on that airline alone when the war ended.
Did you ever meet any enemy resistance on any of these flights?
Yes, we had a couple planes. Well, we had one plane we were sure of was shot down, and we had another that was we think was shot down by a submarine, and then a third one was shot at our own Navy, and they didn't shoot it, knock it down. It put a lot of holes in the tail surfaces. The one was shot down, and this is what's necessary in war. When South Africa moved a large convoy from South Africa to England for the invasion, orders were given to their pilots, as we gave our pilots when we had convoys going. If any airplane came within a certain distance of this convoy, regardless of what it was, to be shot down. Now, we did the same thing. That's wartime procedure. We did the same thing on our convoys. If any airplane came, regardless of who it was, came within a certain range, well, then the fighters would shoot it down. Now, that was necessary because the Germans, at one time, had a large number of our bombers and fighters they'd captured and rebuilt, repaired, and was flying them over with our insignia. So when you saw a B-17 flying out there, it said USA and had the star on it, it didn't necessarily mean that was our plane. It might be a Nazi flying it. So you couldn't take the chances with all the troops involved. Well, we lost one plane. That plane, the pilot didn't know that convoy was there, and was on the way to Africa and flew over it, or started to fly over it, and they shot him down in the ocean. The subs, when we first started, the German submarines, they would stay on surface at night to get their oxygen and so forth. And when they'd hear an airplane, they would dive and get underwater. Sometimes they'd stay on the surface in early morning hours, and our planes would fly over and see them, and they'd dive and get underwater. Well, a little later on, they equipped all the submarines with deck guns. And when the transports come over, they would use their deck guns. And they had quite a few ruses we had to be very careful of. One of the things they'd do at night, they'd be down there lying on top of the water with a deck gun train, and they'd start shooting red flares into the sky. Well, that would be the signal that there was a plane and there's something in distress down there. And if a pilot's first consideration or first thought then would be good to go down and help and see what's wrong and radio in, break emergency radio in. Well, he'd get down there, and about the time he'd fly over it, bang, they'd knock him out of the air. So we learned fast not to trust those flare signals. night. And that happened to me one time. Before President Roosevelt, I took President Roosevelt to Casablanca. I took General Marshall and General Arnold over on the trip, as I mentioned yesterday. And we were down flying over the South America at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I saw this flare come up off of the surface of the water. And General Arnold just happened to be awake, and directly another one came up. And General Arnold didn't realize what it was. He came forward and he said, "What's that lightning? What's that lightning?" In the meantime, I had turned a sharp turn to get out of there. And he was upset. He didn't know what it was about. And so I explained to him what we were up against, what we normally expected. We didn't bother those things because the chance that was the sub laying down there, German sub laying down there, just waiting for us to come over close. He laughed and said, "Well, get the hell out of here, stay out of the way." He was a great guy. So those are the kind of things you run into in wartime. You know, that deception is great in wartime. That's many battles are won on deception. Even the infantries, you know, they'll throw in a brigade up here to attack down the end when they're really going across down here. And the greatest deception in World War II was the invasion of Normandy. The Germans thoroughly believed that whenever the invasion took place, it was going to be across the shortest part of the channel over there east of England. And they had most of their defense prepared there and kept it there for 3 or 4 weeks after the official invasion was made in Normandy. And by the time they got down to Normandy, well, Patton and his army and the Third Army and everything was all pretty well anchored in there. And they never got to have the first, they thought the only way to win it would be to push the troops, the army back in the sea on the landing. That's the only chance they'd have, because we had too many troops, too many supplies. Once we got in and got position, by then they would just be overwhelmed. That was the German attitude.
Considering the bad weather that prevails in Europe so much of the time, were there many accidents bringing transports in with equipment and stuff?
Because of weather?
Yes.
No. The weather over there isn't near as bad as people think it is. It does get bad at times, no doubt about it. England has, it has many types of weather. And if Prestwick was closed in, which is in Scotland, we could move down to many fields, fly another 50 miles, and you'd always found an open place where you could land. It's more like California type weather. Los Angeles may be fogged in solid, but over the hill at Palm Springs is wide open. This is the kind of area. Now, the weather in Europe, I was always surprised because I thought the weather in Europe was terrible, but you know, in Paris, for instance, it's the exception to have any snow there in the wintertime. It doesn't get any colder. The farther east you go, then the colder it gets, no more snow. So when you get in Munich or over in Germany along there, then you get these severe winters. But all that is controlled by the Gulf Stream, going up the Atlantic Ocean and across. If you ever turned that Gulf Stream on, you'd have an Arctic condition in Europe. Ever turned it off?
Yeah. Yeah, they say that's the only thing that keeps England in any ways moderate.
Right. The worst weather you have, and some of the, I think this is a fair statement. The worst weather in the world for flying is in the United States, the northeastern part of the United States, primarily from Detroit to Boston to New York. From a pilot's viewpoint. The worst weather, I mean the most clouds and cloudy conditions. Sure, we have tornadoes in this area and thunderstorms and cloud rain, but when we have one here, why, Denver's open.
The aircraft didn't fly with any kind of aircraft lights, or you didn't have runway lights or anything else in most instances, did you?
No, you'd just have a light. You'd have a light on the airport. You'd have a beacon light, signal the airport. And of course, whenever the radar would show enemy planes coming in, everything was turned off. You know, everything was turned off anyway. You had complete darkness. And then when you got ready to land, you'd see the light get in position, then turn a couple lights on, one on either end of the runways, so you could see where the runway was to land. Then you used your landing lights. See, everything we had to fly by from a navigational viewpoint sort of was taboo in wartime. The lights, there were no lights, for instance. There was no radio, for instance. You couldn't have that because the enemy could use as well as you have. The only time you could use radio would be when you were in an emergency, when you were lost. Didn't know, we had weather or something. Then you could come out in the clear, say, give me a QTE. That was a course to the airport. They'd take a direction finder and spot you. You'd give your number, and they'd take this direction finder and spot you. And all they couldn't tell you how far out, but they could say if you would fly 43 degrees, that would take you over the airport. And then you'd fly 43 degrees, and they'd listen for you. They'd hear you come over the airport if you're upstairs above the clouds, and then they'd tell you when you got over the airport. See, then you could come down through, say we got a 1,000-foot ceiling, and you'd come down through and land. And the only way you got from point A to point B on those long distances was by celestial navigation. That was all there was. And of course that had its limitation, because if you were flying on instruments, you couldn't take a shot. You'd have to fly by dead reckoning. You had to fly precisely. You had to know your wind and make your compass corrections. And it took precise flying on instruments so you wouldn't drift off one side or the other. And then when you broke out in the clear and you could see the North Star, you could take a shot in about 4 minutes. You knew you were on this line. If that was north of the course, you'd change the course for a little bit south, or you're south, you'd change course to fly a little bit to the north, depending on how far off you were. And then when you got a star directly ahead or directly back of you, you could take a shot on that, and that would tell you how far along that line you were. That'd give you approximately within 5 to 10 miles of where you were. You could be that close.
Well, in the early stages of the war, did each transport carry its own navigator? Or
Yes.
You already had that many trained?
Yes, yes. When I told you yesterday about the conversations with Kirk LeMay, when I went back to TWA's chief pilot and the war began to get heat up, I had 2 classes of navigators trained. I took the course myself. I think I took it twice just to make sure I was as good as they were. I didn't take it fully. I took one full course, and then I went back and took a review with it and used it quite a bit. And it's always interesting. I've always found in dealing with pilots that they're like probably other class. It's a class of people. It's much better to lead them than it is to drive them. And during World War II, if we had any kind of a mission that had any degree of danger with it, I always took the first one out myself. I would never ask a pilot to fly a mission that I wouldn't fly myself. And when you get that way in celestial navigation, if your navigator, the pilot's up there, he's the one that's ultimately responsible. And if a navigator isn't well trained or something like that, and you sense it, then you're in a position to help him out and get him back on course. Or, then when you get in, you get a new navigator. But that's what you run up against.
It's been alleged by any number of navigators that I've talked to that they're second-class citizens until war breaks out, and then they're suddenly appreciated.
Very true. There was no use for them to war break. Well, navigators on Pan Am boats, I suppose they used them. They used navigators, but there was no use for them until the war broke out, and then you had to make long-distance flights because, remember, none of us had flown over long distances. As I said in that article there, when Jack Fry, when the chairman of the board, Welsh Pogue, asked me if I'd ever been out of the United States, my only answer was a facetious one that I'd been 1 week in Mexico, which was true.
Was there any thought given into bringing you on full-time with a commission during the war, or did they feel you were more valuable in your position with TWA?
Uh, yes, there was one, 2 or 3 times I would be requested to be brought on active duty. Once was by a classmate of mine who was commanding officer of the area in China. He wanted me to come over and take charge of that area for him, of the Air Force. The main important one was General Arnold. On my first time, I flew him back from England, which was in the summer of '42. He asked me to come back, and he wanted to talk to me. And he said they had a terrific problem of getting airports and an airline set up in Russia. Now you see the Japs came into Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and they had quite a bit of little fighting in there, cleaned them out. That was when that very day I was flying. The day after that, when he'd received a report on it, I was flying General Arnold and General Marshall back from Europe over the Atlantic. And he called me back and he said they had this problem. They wanted to set up an airline from Alaska through southern Russia over to as far as they could go to the southern part of Russia, I suppose.